The gavel came down with a sharp crack as Judge Andrew Napolitano imposed a $5,000 contempt fine on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, his voice dripping with judicial arrogance as he lectured her about respecting court authority. For exactly 8 seconds, Napolitano basked in his perceived victory, confident that his judicial power had silenced another uppity politician. Then Crockett stood up, reached into her briefcase, and pulled out a folder that would destroy his career within minutes. What happened next would prove that some people are far more dangerous when you try to silence them than when you let them speak. Judge Andrew Napolitano had spent decades wielding judicial authority like a personal weapon, first as a New Jersey Superior Court judge and later as a Fox News legal analyst who never missed an opportunity to remind others of his judicial credentials. The 74-year-old former jurist had built his post-bench career on constitutional pontificating and legal superiority, returning to occasional special judicial duties while maintaining his media presence as a self-appointed guardian of judicial dignity. His authoritative speaking style and condescending demeanor had intimidated countless attorneys and witnesses over the years, reflecting his deep belief that judicial robes confer moral as well as legal authority. Napolitano viewed challenges to judicial power as personal affronts that demanded swift and decisive punishment. Sitting in the witness chair was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a 44-year-old Texas Democrat whose background as a civil rights attorney had given her extensive experience challenging judicial misconduct and corruption. Unlike the typical politicians who wilted under judicial pressure, Crockett possessed both the legal expertise and moral courage necessary to confront judges who abused their authority. Her years in courtrooms fighting discrimination cases had taught her that judicial robes didn't automatically confer wisdom or integrity, and that some of the greatest threats to justice came from judges who believed themselves above accountability. Today's hearing on congressional oversight of judicial ethics would prove to be the arena where Napolitano's judicial arrogance met someone who understood that true respect for the law sometimes required challenging those who claimed to embody it. The federal court hearing on congressional oversight powers and judicial ethics had drawn national attention as Congress examined its authority to investigate judicial misconduct. The packed courtroom included legal scholars, civil rights advocates, and judicial reform activists, all watching as the delicate balance between judicial independence and democratic accountability was tested in real time. Judge Napolitano presided over the hearing with his characteristic imperial bearing, making it clear from the outset that he viewed congressional oversight of the judiciary as a dangerous overreach that threatened the constitutional separation of powers. His opening remarks had been a stern lecture on judicial independence and the sacred nature of judicial authority. This court will not tolerate any attempt to undermine the independence of the federal judiciary through politically motivated investigations, Napolitano declared, his voice carrying the weight of assumed moral authority. The founders established an independent judiciary precisely to protect it from the whims of political majorities and ambitious politicians. When Crockett's turn came to present testimony about patterns of judicial misconduct and the need for accountability mechanisms, her approach was methodical and professional. She began outlining documented cases of judges who had violated ethics rules, received improper benefits, and failed to recuse themselves from cases involving conflicts of interest. Your Honor, with respect, the evidence shows a pattern of judicial misconduct that threatens public confidence in our court system, Crockett testified, her voice calm but firm. When judges operate without accountability, they undermine the very rule of law they claim to protect. Napolitano's interruption was swift and hostile. Congresswoman, you will confine your remarks to matters within your constitutional purview. This court will not be lectured about judicial conduct by politicians who seek to subordinate the judiciary to political pressure. The rebuke was designed to intimidate Crockett into retreat, but she pressed forward with her presentation. Your Honor, Congress has both the authority and the responsibility to ensure that federal judges operate within ethical bounds. Congresswoman. Napolitano's voice rose sharply. You are out of order. This court's patience with your disrespectful grandstanding has reached its limit. The room fell silent as everyone recognized that a dangerous confrontation was building between judicial authority and congressional oversight, with neither side prepared to back down. Napolitano leaned forward from the bench, his expression conveying barely contained fury at what he perceived as an assault on judicial dignity. Congresswoman Crockett, your continued attempts to impugn the integrity of the federal judiciary demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional principles and proper courtroom decorum. His voice took on a lecturing tone that had intimidated countless lawyers over the decades. Perhaps in the political arena, you are accustomed to making inflammatory accusations without consequence. But in this courtroom, such behavior will not be tolerated. Crockett remained perfectly composed, her legal training evident in her calm response to Napolitano's escalating hostility. Your Honor, I am simply presenting documented evidence of judicial misconduct that requires congressional attention. The cases I'm citing involve federal judges who have violated clearly established ethics rules. You are citing unsubstantiated allegations and politically motivated attacks, Napolitano shot back, his judicial mask beginning to slip. This court will not be used as a platform for advancing partisan congressional investigations designed to intimidate independent judges. The exchange was electric with tension as two legal minds clashed over fundamental questions of judicial accountability. Crockett pulled out a thick folder of documents, her movements deliberate and professional. Your Honor, these are not unsubstantiated allegations. These are findings from the Judicial Conference, the Department of Justice, and federal court administrative offices. Would the court like me to cite specific case numbers and ethics violations? Napolitano's face reddened visibly as he realized Crockett was far better prepared than he had anticipated. Her calm professionalism was making his hostility appear increasingly unreasonable to the observers in the courtroom. Congresswoman, your selective citation of isolated incidents does not justify the wholesale assault on judicial independence that your committee is pursuing, he replied, but his voice had lost some of its earlier conviction. Isolated incidents. Crockett's eyebrows rose slightly. Your Honor, we've documented over 200 cases of potential ethics violations by federal judges in the past 5 years alone. At what point does a pattern of misconduct cease to be isolated incidents and become a systemic problem requiring oversight? The question hung in the air as legal observers recognized the intellectual precision of Crockett's challenge. She was systematically dismantling Napolitano's arguments while maintaining perfect courtroom decorum. Napolitano's response revealed his growing desperation. This court finds your questioning inappropriate and your demeanor disrespectful to judicial authority. You will confine your remarks to prepared testimony and cease this improper line of inquiry. But Crockett was just getting started. Your Honor, with respect, questioning judicial conduct is not disrespectful. It's essential to maintaining public confidence in our justice system. The American people have a right to know when judges violate their oaths of office. The moment that began Napolitano's destruction came when his judicial arrogance overcame his legal judgment, providing Crockett with the opening she had been waiting for. Congresswoman Crockett, this court has reached the limit of its patience with your disrespectful behavior, Napolitano declared, his voice rising with imperial fury. You are hereby held in contempt of court and fined $5,000 for your persistent attempts to undermine judicial authority. The gavel came down with finality as Napolitano basked in his perceived victory. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as observers recognized the extraordinary nature of a sitting judge fining a member of Congress for asking questions about judicial ethics. Crockett remained perfectly calm as the fine was imposed, her expression betraying no emotion as Napolitano continued his lecture. Perhaps this financial penalty will remind you and your congressional colleagues that judicial independence is not subject to political pressure or grandstanding. But instead of being intimidated, Crockett stood up with deliberate composure. Your Honor, I respectfully request permission to address the court regarding the legal basis for this contempt citation. Napolitano waved dismissively. You have forfeited your right to address this court through your disrespectful conduct. Your Honor, Crockett interrupted smoothly. Rule 42 of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure requires that before imposing contempt sanctions, the court must provide the alleged contemner with notice of the specific conduct constituting contempt and an opportunity to respond. Was this procedure followed? The question caught Napolitano completely off guard. His confidence faltered as he realized he had acted impulsively without following proper legal procedures, exactly the kind of judicial misconduct that Crockett had been discussing. The contempt was obvious and immediate, Napolitano replied weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. Crockett opened her briefcase and pulled out a legal document. Your Honor, I have here a copy of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, along with relevant case law on summary contempt powers. Would the court like me to cite the specific requirements that must be met before imposing financial sanctions? The room fell silent as everyone recognized that the tables had turned. Napolitano had just provided Crockett with a perfect example of the judicial overreach she had been describing. What happened next would be remembered as one of the most devastating judicial exposures in American legal history. Crockett opened her second folder with surgical precision, her voice growing stronger as she delivered what would become the most quoted moment of her political career. Your Honor, since the court has chosen to impose sanctions without following proper procedure, perhaps this is an appropriate time to discuss judicial accountability and the consequences of judges who operate outside established legal standards. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years in courtrooms challenging abuse of power. Because what just happened, a judge imposing punishment without due process, is exactly the kind of misconduct that requires congressional oversight. She held up a document that made Napolitano's face go ashen. This is a complaint filed with the Judicial Conduct and Disability Committee in 1994 during your tenure on the New Jersey Superior Court. It documents multiple instances of ex parte communications with attorneys appearing before your court. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Napolitano sat frozen as Crockett methodically exposed his own history of judicial misconduct. The complaint details how you held private meetings with defense attorneys in criminal cases, discussing plea negotiations and sentencing recommendations outside the presence of prosecutors or court reporters. This behavior violated fundamental principles of judicial ethics and due process. Her voice rose with prosecutorial intensity as she continued. But that's not all, Your Honor. These financial records show that during the same period you received substantial benefits from law firms that appeared before your court, luxury trips, expensive dinners, and other gifts that created clear conflicts of interest. The courtroom erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs as the scope of Napolitano's ethical violations became clear. Legal scholars and court observers looked stunned as Crockett systematically dismantled the reputation of the man who had just tried to silence her. The pattern we see here is identical to what happened moments ago, Crockett declared, her voice filling every corner of the courtroom. A judge who believes his authority places him above the law, who punishes those who question his conduct, and who operates without regard for the procedural safeguards that protect all Americans. She turned to face Napolitano directly. Your Honor, you have just demonstrated exactly why judicial oversight is necessary. You imposed a fine without due process, exactly as you violated judicial ethics during your time on the bench. You have proven my point about judicial accountability better than any testimony I could have given. Napolitano tried desperately to respond, but his voice cracked with panic. These are old allegations that were never substantiated. Never substantiated. Crockett's voice cut through his objection like a sword. Your Honor, you resign from the bench rather than face formal disciplinary proceedings. The New Jersey Supreme Court's Ethics Committee had already begun investigating these violations when you chose to leave the judiciary for television. The final blow was devastating in its simplicity. You didn't retire to become a media commentator, Your Honor. You fled the bench to avoid accountability for judicial misconduct. And today, 30 years later, you're still trying to escape accountability by silencing those who ask uncomfortable questions. The silence that followed was deafening. Napolitano sat completely motionless, his earlier arrogance replaced by the hollow expression of a man whose hypocrisy had been exposed in the most public way possible. Within minutes, legal Twitter exploded as news of the confrontation spread across social media platforms. Hashtag Napolitano exposed and hashtag Crockett destroys judge began trending worldwide as video clips of the exchange were shared by legal professionals, civil rights advocates, and political observers. The moment when Napolitano's own judicial misconduct was revealed became an instant symbol of judicial accountability meeting corrupt authority. Legal publications scrambled to cover the story, with constitutional law professors praising Crockett's masterful demonstration of why judicial oversight was essential. Even conservative legal scholars acknowledged that Napolitano's behavior had been problematic and counterproductive to judicial independence. The Federal Judicial Center immediately announced a review of Napolitano's conduct during the hearing, while several judicial ethics organizations called for formal investigations into his current and past behavior. Law schools began using clips of Crockett's testimony in their judicial ethics courses as an example of how to challenge judicial misconduct professionally and effectively. Napolitano's media career suffered immediate damage, with Fox News quietly reducing his on-air appearances as his credibility as a legal analyst crumbled. Legal colleagues who had previously deferred to his judicial experience now openly questioned his fitness to comment on judicial matters. Democratic leaders hailed Crockett's performance as a watershed moment for judicial accountability, proving that even federal judges must answer for their conduct when they violate established legal standards. The confrontation accelerated congressional discussions about judicial reform that had been stalled for years. In the days that followed, legal analysts would debate what had made Crockett's takedown so devastating. Some pointed to her superior legal preparation and courtroom experience. Others emphasized how she had remained professional while Napolitano lost his judicial temperament. But the real power of the moment lay in its demonstration of authentic accountability confronting corrupt authority. For too long, some federal judges had operated as if their lifetime tenure made them immune from consequences for their actions. Napolitano had embodied this arrogance, believing that his judicial credentials gave him the right to silence critics and operate without oversight. Crockett had shattered that entire framework by proving that judicial robes don't confer moral authority, only legal responsibility.